little bit about our guest speaker. Dr. Ed Pappas is a professor emeritus of communication at Wayne State University. He served for 19 years as chairman of the Department of Communications and was a professor in the department for over 30 years. Before coming to Wayne State, he taught high school English and coached debate. He is a baseball historian and co-author of They Tasted Glory, Amongst the Missing in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He is currently working on another baseball book titled Motor City Mound Masters, The Best of Tiger Pitchers, a history of the best hurlers from 1900 to 2000. Pappas has taught the history of baseball movies for the Film Studies program at Wayne State and has lectured on the topic, and I was fortunate enough to hear some of his lectures. They are certainly fantastic. Diamonds on the silver screen for the Society of Active Retirees SOAR, and Dr. Pappas holds a PhD in rhetoric and public address and has appeared before many corporate, educational, religious groups discussing the problems and progress of human communication. He's been a visiting professor at a number of universities, including a stint at Anatolia College, and I can't pronounce
Thessaloniki.
Thessaloniki, Greece. He's a member of several academic societies. He's a member of the Eddy Lake Society, a group of baseball aficionados who meet monthly to exchange old baseball tales and trivia. I think, isn't Ernie Harwell one of those regulars?
Yeah.
He lives with his wife, Eunice, in Rochester Hills. It's a great pleasure to present Dr. Ed Pappas.
Thank you. Jerry was in the class that I taught this past spring, and there were three lectures that I did on baseball films. The first one dealt with biographies, and one of the biographies, of course, was Hank Greenberg, one of the local heroes, and one of the really fine biopics produced. It was Greenberg's, it was a professor of history at Wayne, Milt Kavinsky, whose stepdaughter, Aviva Kempner, who brought this to light in 2000. Very nice. We also dealt with Monty Stratton, the story of the White Sox player who lost his leg in an accident in 1938, killing a very nice emerging career. Jimmy Stewart played him in the movie, and June Allison was his wife. And then we dealt with 8 Men Out, the only pure documentary in the array of baseball films. And just for the record, there are 150 feature-length films that have baseball as their primary topic. Either the star is a baseball player, and they fall into different categories. In the fall, I'm going to be doing a 3-session series on fantasy baseball films, and I'm going to be dealing with one that all of you have seen, I'm sure, Field of Dreams. And then I'm going all the way back to 1948 and picking up that wonderful film starring Ray Milland. It Happens Every Spring. Milland is a chemistry professor, and he discovers a substance that repels wood. And so when he rubs it on a ball, when the pitcher throws the ball, it jumps across the bat. And of course, he wins 30 games, and the Cardinals, his home team, win the pennant. And he, gets the big lab that he wants. And then the third one that I'll be doing is one that was done initially in '51 and then repeated in 1991 or 2, Angels in the Outfield, which is a nice children's film, but definitely fantasy. You can do others.
It is.
Pardon me? When Jerry asked me to whether I would be interested in coming and speaking to you, it was like asking someone who loves baseball to go to a ball game. I mean, to have an audience and to talk about baseball, I mean, that's as good as it gets. That's why I volunteer my time to SOAR, because it gives me an opportunity to deal with something that is a passion for me. Actually, when you talk about trivia, it doesn't take a baseball fan like me long to determine at what level someone is in terms of baseball. You know, one or two questions immediately say, well, this guy is interesting, or this woman knows baseball, but I'm not gonna show off. There are a couple of people. Well, certainly the people in the Eddie Lake Society. And by the way, Eddie Lake was a very obscure shortstop for the Tigers in the post-war years. They traded with the Red Sox. They traded their big first baseman Rudy York to get Eddie Lake, and Lake played for them in 1946, 47, 48, and he was fairly decent in terms of on-base percentage, but because he's so obscure, when this group was formed, and the founding father of our group was Joe Falls, and if you were to visit one of these meetings, you would say these guys are nuts. There are a couple of women as well, and because you know, we called to mind, just as we did, the statistics and the names of players of other eras, you know, the 34, 35 Tigers, or the 1919 White Sox, or the 1909 Pirates, for that matter. Just, in fact, one member said to me, he said, you know, trivia, he said, do you know who Harry Lundy was? And I thought for a minute, and I knew it was a kind of a trick question. And so I took a stab at it because I thought I knew the answer to that. And I said, he's the guy who pinch ran for Ray Chapman. Now, Ray Chapman is the only player in the history of baseball to die on the field. I mean, he was hit by a pitch ball in 1920, and now who would remember the pinch runner who comes in to run? The baseball game continued. He was taken to the hospital, died that night, and was replaced by Joe Sewell. So that's, you know, it's not a trick question, it's a legitimate question, but it's not one that, you know, the average fan would know or be interested in knowing, for that matter. I have one other colleague who happens also to be a judge, Judge Matthews. He's in Dearborn. I don't know if you know Mark Plawecki, a young circuit court judge there, and he is, we are in the same league. So when we get together to talk, everybody else leaves because either they don't understand or they're not interested in, you know, what we're talking about. I'm not a sports writer. As Jerry said, I'm a retired professor. My field of study is the study of language, the use of language, the critique of speeches made by politicians and other public figures. For example, with respect to language, there have developed so many ways to describe game-ending home runs. We used to say back in 1951, Russ Hodges, the Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. He repeated it 4 times. No one ever used the expression, which has become the cliche of today, walk-off home run. I don't know where that came from, but it is currently the youth. And Bill Sapphire, in his column on language, had kind of an interesting... baseball has really lent a lot to the language. I mean, we all say, so-and-so is pinch hitting for me. And you might say he's out in left field for somebody who really doesn't understand the subject. So there are many expressions that have come to us from baseball. Great expressions, because there's so much talk radio and talk television. There are people who are on camera who really have no sense of language, but just repeat, and we develop cliches. Back when many of us were growing up, the old expression, when there was a high fly ball, what do we call it? Anyone? A big high fly ball, a can of corn. A can of corn. Now, the kids today wouldn't understand it. Why a can of corn? Because when he went into the old grocery and he needed to get a can of corn, he would get that little hook and get the corn and he'd catch it. And that's where that expression came from. Or expressions like he died on third. You know, you were stranded at second, you were left on first, but you died on third. And that, what a wonderful expression, he died on third. I still teach a section of a course in the honors program at Wayne. My students are typically 18 to 20, and they're all freshmen. All of them are on scholarships, and they're very, very smart. And that's why I do it, because they energize me. And talking about baseball does the same thing. That's why I'm here today. The topic I want to spend a little time with stems from the very well-done movie, 8 Men Out, which was directed by the very notable director John Sayles. Orion Pictures distributed the film in September, I can't believe it, September of '88, 17 years ago. And of the 4 major studio baseball films released in '88 and '89, 8 Men Out was the least successful financially. That's what happens to documentaries, baseball documentaries. People want the Hollywood finish, as in The Natural. The Natural, of course, totally changed from the book. If you ever read The Natural by Bernard Malamud in 1952, the guy strikes out. And it's a story, really, of a bunch of bad characters. There's not a good person in the book. Everyone's a rat, a gambler, a show-off. But The Natural could not be put on Hollywood with that ending. And so he hits a home run, hits the lights, and it's a glorious ending. Bull Durham came out in that year, '88 and '89. It's a very well done story of a career minor leaguer who was called up to get a gifted rookie ready for the big leagues. You all remember the story, starring Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins. And that picture did fairly well, the best of those 4. It certainly made a profit for the studio. Field of Dreams came out the same time, was a fantasy of the return of the players banished in 1921, the ones that I'm going to be talking about. You know, in the voice that says, first, if you build it, he will come. And then it says, ease his pain. And finally says, go the distance. Wonderful fantasy. But we got caught in it, and we watched it and suspended judgment and let the story go. And the last of the 4 films was Major League. That was the one starring Sheen, Charlie Sheen, and a couple of other fairly good people. And it was the unlikely story of an unlikely last-place team coming back to win the pennant to prevent their owner, a woman who had inherited the team from her husband who passed away, from moving that team to Florida. But yet 8 Men Out was the real documentary that told the story of the worst scandal to befall Major League Baseball, what became known as the Black Sox scandal. And before I discuss this most negative event, that is now, 86 years ago, and it always comes up. You know, people talk about the Black Sox scandal. I just wanted to mention the book that Jerry mentioned, the title that They Tasted Glory Among the Missing in the Baseball Hall of Fame. What we did was we wrote about players who early in their wonderful, promising careers stumbled, got injured, got sick, or died. We wrote about Smokey Joe Wood, who was one of the finest pitchers of his day. Wood rivaled Walter Johnson of the Senators, at least for the 1912 season, winning 35 games and then another 3 in the World Series. But then a sore arm curtailed his pitching career and deprived him of Cooperstown. When this book came out in 1998, about 2 years later, we got a letter from his son, who was 81 at the time, and he wondered if he could use our chapter to appeal to the Old Timers Committee to get his father into the Hall of Fame. And of course we said yes, but he doesn't have the numbers. You don't put somebody in on the basis of one season. We also wrote about Pete Reeser, who in 1941 was the rival of Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Does anybody remember Pete Reeser?
Yeah.
He had a penchant for crashing into walls, and it was because of him that we now have the warning track. Before that, there was no warning track, and when a player went back to catch a fly ball, he just would go and go, and if he didn't watch, he would crash into the wall. And he crashed in, fractured his skull once, and really hurt himself 2 or 3 times, and that definitely curtailed his career. We talked about Herb Score, who was a worthy successor to Bob Feller, and he caught the ball on his eye and never came back, from Gil McDougall. And we talked about Ewell Blackwell of the Reds. We talked about Tony Conigliaro, who hit more home runs before he was 20 than anybody else, and then he caught a line drive. No, he caught a pitch ball to his head and curtailed his career. And then we talked about a local. You all remember, it's now going to be 30 years next year, Mark Fidrich, the bird who talked to the ball. These were all, who tasted glory, but had shortened careers and didn't quite have enough to make it to the Hall of Fame. But that is not the focus of this talk. I want to talk about the ugliest incident in what is mostly a storied history of baseball. The interesting thing about it, and I want to kind of set the stage for you in terms of time. It's 1919. Babe Ruth is still with the Red Sox. They trade him to the Red Sox, and in 1919, Babe Ruth hits 29 home runs, which is then the record. The record was 26, and he hits 29. In January 3rd of 1920, the Red Sox owner, Frazee, who's a big-time producer on Broadway, needs money to pull off the production of No No Nanette, and sells Babe Ruth to the Red Sox. And that was, of course, the start of the curse of the Bambino that was not ended until last year's World Series, hanging over them. The war ended the previous November. World War I ended the previous November. Wilson is still president, and Ty Cobb won his final batting title. He won 12 batting titles. Nobody's come close. I think the next is 8. Honus Wagner and what's his name? Tony Gwynn. But nobody else has won 12. And he wins his last batting title. The White Sox are one of the finest teams assembled. They earned the name Black Sox, by the way, not because of the scandal. Most people think that the Black Sox, you took white and made it black because it was a black mark. During the 1918 season, Charlie Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, and by the way, I understand you're going to see the White Sox play at the end of the month.
Yeah, the 30th.
On the 30th. I always remind my Chicago friends that the Cubs last won a championship in 1908 when they beat the Tigers. And the White Sox last won a championship in 1917.
Oh, boy.
So it's been a long time for the Windy City. And, of course, the Cub fans are almost like the Red Sox fans. It's what Roger Angel said, being a Red Sox fan is a malady. It's an incurable sickness. So during the 1918 season, Comiskey refused. He was a very stingy owner, really didn't pay his players what they were worth. And I'll get into some of that in just a bit. But he refused to pay for the cleaning of the team's uniforms. And the players began wearing increasingly dirty uniforms for weeks at a time. After a while, they began to refer to themselves as the Black Sox because their uniforms were dirty. Not only did the name catch on, but became associated with the scandal that occurred just 1 year later. Very interesting, about a month ago, the Detroit News carried an article written by Neil Rubin. You know how he writes an article in the Sunday paper inside the front page. And by the way, he's a fairly staunch baseball fan himself. The title of the article was "Man's Baseball Lineage, a Point of Pride, Not Shame." The article was about a young man, Greg Seacott, whose father, Al Seacott, had a brief career in the big leagues. He won 10 and lost 13. But it's Al's uncle that was Eddie Seacott, one of the central figures in the throwing of the series in 1919. According to Rubin, the Rubin article, Seacott recently purchased Eddie's 1917 Sox jersey for $46,000. He's in the insurance business, and when that jersey became available, he didn't know how he was going to pay for it. He signed a contract. It was like $960 a month for whatever length of time, but he wanted that jersey. He said that his great uncle, is revered within the family for being a great pitcher. Eddie wasn't proud of what he did, Greg said, and neither is the family, but they understand and accept it because that's how families play the game. Now, baseball had several gambling incidents in the early years, but none as clumsy and with higher stakes than the Black Sox scandal. Even today, there's been lots of discussion about Pete Rose, who gambled on baseball. And many times when I go to a group, the group will say, "Well, what do you think, Professor? Should he be in the Hall of Fame?" Yeah. Well, you know what? I'll answer with the man who was at Johnny Bench.
Yeah.
Where was he?
Tam O'Shanter on Monday.
Tam O'Shanter on Monday.
Yeah.
He was interviewed recently, and he was one of Rose's teammates. And he is adamant that because Rose bet on baseball and was caught at it, that he does not deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Now, it's a real question because obviously his statistics deserve Hall of Fame status. But, once again, to use the cliche slippery slope, if they install him in the Hall of Fame, there's going to be a big, huge cry for Shoeless Joe Jackson, who left baseball with an average of .356, third highest lifetime. Well, we'll get to that too, because Eddie Seacott was one of the finest pitchers in 1919. By that time, he had already amassed over 200 wins, and he was at the top of his game when he won 29 and lost 7, with a remarkable earned run average of 1.82. In 1917, when the Sox won their last championship, now 88 years, he won 28 games. Comiskey had promised Eddie Cicotte $10,000 bonus if he won 30. And as the film shows, as soon as he got close, the owner said to the manager, bench him. 2 weeks to go in the season, he certainly would have won 30 games, but he didn't get the opportunity. By way of contrast, Dutch Ruther of the Cincinnati Reds made twice that after being in the league only 2 years. So owner Charlie Comiskey really had the players vulnerable and susceptible to gamblers by paying them much less than the market value. And in 1919 and on through the 70s, the players had no recourse but to accept what the owner and general manager offered. There was no free agency. But the fix would not have occurred had it not been for ringleader Chuck Gandil, their first baseman. Gandil approached Joseph Sport Sullivan, who was the front man for big-time gambler Arnold Rothstein. The gamblers agreed to pay the players to lose the series they were heavily favored to win. But the talk about this took place 2 weeks before the series started. So there was all kinds of rumors about the series being tainted. And that worked against the gamblers because the odds shifted. And so what was, as we call today, to borrow a basketball term, a slam dunk, turned out to be a more even series at that time. Gandil went first to his shortstop. And by the way, the players on the White Sox in 1919 were factionalized, heavily factionalized. There was Eddie Collins, who was a Columbia graduate, who was making $15,000. They bought him from the Athletics. Connie Mack would build these great teams, and then he'd run out of money and sell off the players. He did it twice in his lifetime. He did it first after the 1914 series, then he did it after the 1930 series, when he sold off players like Jimmy Fox and Mickey Cochran and who was the other? Lefty Grove. So there was $80,000 involved by most, and the players. He went first to his shortstop, Swede Risberg, and he said, "We can get 80 grand. There'll be 10 grand for each of us if we throw the series." So they decided, in order to throw a series, a baseball series, you would need to have at least a pitcher. Now, there was a utility infielder, his name was Fred McMullen, who overheard the conversation between Gandil and Risberg, and he demanded to be cut in or blow the whistle. So here, this utility player who batted 170 in the season and only got 2 at-bats in the World Series got cut in for a full share of the gambler's money. Well, certainly with shady characters like this, things didn't go the way they wanted. Gandil took $35,000. Cicotte wanted $10,000. He was buying a farm and he was trying to secure the future of his 2 little girls. And he wasn't going to get the money from Comiskey, so he took it from the gamblers. And the signal for the fix was that the first batter up for Cincinnati in Chicago, in Comiskey Park, would be hit. There would be a hit batsman, and that was going to be the signal that the fix was on. And sure enough, the guy comes up, and he's hit by a pitch, and the gamblers relax, and the fix is on. So Cicotte loses the first game. Now, before we go on, let me talk about the other players. They went to the third baseman, a very, very fine third baseman, who may have made it to the Hall of Fame ultimately. He was fairly young and had a wonderful year in 1920 as well. Buck Weaver. Now, Buck Weaver heard all about the fix, and he said, "I don't want any part of it." And so he had a wonderful series, batted over 300, made no errors, but he knew about it and didn't tell. So he became one of the 8 men out. So there's Risberg, there's Weaver, there's Gandill and McMullen, and then there's Eddie Seacott. They figured we need another pitcher. So they went to 20-game winner Lefty Williams. And Lefty Williams did not want to become a part of it. But then when he found out that Seacott was there, he said he joined the group. And if it were not for Williams, they may not have lost the series. Because Williams lost 3 games by himself. 3 games, including the last game, where he was booted out after 1/3 of an inning, gave up 4 runs, and that was the 3rd loss. And by the way, that series was the 16th World Series. They did not have a series in 1 and 2 because the National League did not want to play the American League. They played a series in 1903 that was won by the Red Sox. And then the National League said, no more for us. But they came back in 1905. And in 1905, the National League won its first World Series. And so then this was the 16th series. And they had 4 series right at that time that were best 5 out of 9. And that ended in 1921. No more 5 out of 9. So then they went to the illiterate, gifted outfielder, shoeless Joe Jackson. Jackson was illiterate. In fact, at one time he came to Detroit and he hit a triple and was on third base, and this is also in the movie, but authenticated otherwise. Somebody yelled out to him, said, "Joe, can you spell cat?" And he yelled back, he yelled at the umpire, "Can you spell shit?" That was his retort to the umpire. I mean, to the baseball fan. And also, it was Joe Jackson who, again, the story about the young kid after the fix is uncovered coming out and say it ain't so, Joe. They say that did not happen that way. He didn't say it ain't so, Joe. But Sales, the director of the movie, said when legend interferes with history, say the legend. Go with the legend. And that's why, again, when they talk about Ruth pointing out the home run, that's legend. Whether he did it or not is immaterial at this point. So they finally get the outfielder Hap Felsch and Joe Jackson. So you have your full fix. Before the 7th game, before the 8th game, this series ended in 8 games, best 5 out of 9, but they won their 5 games. A gambler came up to Lefty Williams, who was going to start that last game, and said to him that if he did not comply, did not go along with the fix, something was going to happen to his family. And so he went out and got shelled in 1/3 of an inning. So Gandill, most of the players got 5,000. Gandill got 35,000, the ringleader, and Seacott got 10,000. After the series, Comiskey hired a detective to shadow the 8 players. The detective finds Gandill, the ringleader, retires from baseball after the 1919 series. Before the trial, before the new commissioner comes in, he retires, and he finds that he's purchased a new house, a car, and some diamonds. The other 7 players, all 7 players, played in the 1920 season because the fix was not uncovered until 1920. This outfielder, Felsch, has bats .338. Joe Jackson, in his final year, bats a resounding .382 to finish 3rd in the batting race. And the two tainted pitchers, Williams and Seacott, one wins 22 and one wins 21 in 1920. The trial starts in August of 1921. The new commissioner suspends all players on March the 12th. He said the players are acquitted by the jury after 2 hours of deliberation. It was almost like an OJ trial because the signed confessions suddenly disappear, and they had just hired Judge Landis and gave him $50,000, which was a huge sum of money in 1921, and he decided he was going to make sure that the players got the lesson. It was almost similar to what Commissioner Stern did with the players, the Indiana players who went into the stand. The one in particular banishing him for the entire season. Despite several attempts to be reinstated, the players never play baseball in the big leagues again, and the ugliest chapter in the history ends. I might add that there's the second ugliest, or maybe the co-ugliest, was the keeping blacks out of baseball until 1947. I just finished reading a book by Carl Erskine, Lessons I Learned from Jackie Robinson. And you can imagine, oh my, you can imagine, got a lot of editing to do. You can imagine what would have happened to baseball had African Americans been allowed to play in the 20s and 30s. Players like Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell. I just came back from visiting the museum in Kansas City. It is a wonderful museum. It's the Negro Baseball Museum, and kind of a tribute to the great players, Josh Gibson among them. And they're kind of captured in a movie that, in one of these subsequent deals I'm going to deal with, Baseball and Race. That's only, what is it, 57 years ago. That's really recent compared to the Black Sox scandal. I have prepared a little handout for you which has a synopsis of the scandal. It gives you the 8 men out, my analysis of why it happened, the origin of the name, the factions on the team. I talked about the factions. The other faction was Eddie Collins and the catcher, Ray Shaw, who didn't talk to anybody else on the team. The gamblers. By the way, the lead gambler made a huge bet on the 1928 election, and a month later he was shot dead in his hotel room, Arnold Rothstein. The money, the signal, and then I have a kind of rundown of the shoddy play by game, and then the verdict, and finally the 8 and their fate, what happened to the 8 players. I certainly would be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
My only regret is that my husband could not be here because we have seen Field of Dreams no less than 20 times, and the others probably as equal amount of time. So, but the fact that you say it's a fantasy is going to be way heavily on me tonight. So.
well, the fantasy, of course. Thank you very much, very much. We really appreciate it. All right. Number one, they hear voices. The idea of the dream and living out your dream. He wanted to build the stadium.
Right.
How fanciful is that? They're going to go and capture the guy who's supposedly J.D. Salinger. But it's a wonderful movie, and we suspend our judgment. I remember when I first saw that movie, I gasped because they have him batting right-handed and he's left-handed, and but once again, the idea is, if you're making a movie about fantasy, well, why can't the left-hander bat right-handed and vice versa? But you mentioned something that's very interesting. Babe Ruth comes on the scene just after the Black Sox scandal. Babe Ruth could have made it to the Hall of Fame as a pitcher. He was an outstanding pitcher, won 3 games in the, I think, 1917 World Series. And the year they trade him, 1920, to the Red Sox, he hits 54 home runs. Now, somebody mentioned steroids. I do want to mention, make one comment, and then we'll quit with that. And this is, again, a passion with me. For 95 years, the standard for home runs is 50. Maris hit 61, and there's all kinds of problems with that because he did it in 162 games, and they gave him an asterisk.
Yeah.
And there's a movie that was produced here in Detroit by Billy Crystal called 61, the story of Roger Maris. There were 11 players between 1900 and 1996 who hit 50 or more home runs. And it was done 16 times. Ruth did it 3 times, Fox did it twice, Mantle twice, Kiner twice. Then, since 1996, it's been done again 14 times by 9 more players, including Sosa, who's hit 63 times, Griffey, 50 twice, McGuire, 60 and 70 3 times. Now, you can't tell me. I mean, baseball records like 3,000 hits, 500 home runs, they don't lie. I mean, those. So something happened between 1996 and whether it was as a result of the strike, trying to get people back into the ballparks, which they've succeeded in doing, something happened.
What about
These records, from my standpoint, are not clean records.
Too many teams. When I was growing up, there was 8 teams in each league. Now you're bringing people in the league that they had
Without
240.
question. Without question.
And they wouldn't even be in the major leagues 50 years ago.
But you know what? The commentary on that is real simple. They wanted to get rid of teams, didn't they? They had an opportunity to get rid of Montreal. What did they do? They moved Montreal back to Washington. By the way, Washington's doing very well. They're in first place. Back when I was growing up, it was first in war. Washington was first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League.
Oh, I'll tell you who was at my camp who played for Washington, Cecil Travis.
Oh, yes, wonderful.
Wonderful hitter.
He would have been in the Hall of Fame except for the war.
The war, he was very good.
One more question.
What about Pete Rose? What do you think about Pete Rose?
I think Pete Rose's record stands for itself. The idea of putting him into the Hall of Fame after he did this is such a controversial thing. Some people say, look, Babe Ruth did some unsavory things. Ty Cobb, by the way, we could give a speech on Ty Cobb and Tress Speaker and their gambling that was hushed because they were the big stars. That would have really been a blow. So I think it's really a question. I always thought that he should be in the Hall of Fame because guy hits 4,000 hits, 4,200 hits. But then when I heard Johnny Bench, I think the players ought to make that decision, not the writers. The writers today, by the way, they don't know the game the way the writers did when we were growing up. You know, for example, Alan Trammell comes up for the Hall of Fame, or Whitaker. I'm not saying they should be shoo-ins, but he didn't get enough votes to stay on the ballot. Whitaker, he played 20 years in the big leagues with a average that's as good as Joe Morgan's.
Well, how about today's Tigers, just as a final note? We're going to see them play. What do you think?
I'll tell you something. I think they've got a very, very nice team this year. They've got 4 pitchers, Robertson, Marath, Bonderman, and Johnson. Now, those are 4 good pitchers. They need another pitcher. If the guy they got from the White Sox had not been injured, I think the Tigers right now would be flirting with Minnesota and would be 5 or 6 games out. So I've got real optimism for the Tigers. I hope Ordonez comes back, and if he does come back, look for a pretty good season for them.
Right, well, we certainly thank you very much. That was really wonderful.
Civic Center.